Hey everybody, welcome to Algo Expert. In this video, we're going to explain what behavioral interviews really are. The interesting thing about behavioral interviews is that, on the one hand, they're very easy to define, but on the other hand, they're very difficult to define. Difficult because depending on the company that you're interviewing at, or the type of candidate that you are, for example, how much work experience you have, what company you're coming from, or what school or what coding boot camp you're coming from, depending on that, they might be packaged a little bit differently. For example, if you're interviewing at Google for a software engineering position, as of mid-2018, I think, all of their behavioral interviews are called Googliness and leadership interviews, and they assess you on your Googliness and leadership. Now, Googliness is a Google-specific term that means a lot of things, and as you'll see in a second, it's not that much different from what other companies are assessing you on, but that's what it's called. If you're interviewing at Amazon, for example, as far as I know, Amazon really focuses their behavioral interviews on their leadership principles, which are publicly available. You can look them up online. If you're interviewing at Facebook, my understanding is that behavioral interviews at Facebook are just called non-technical interviews. So the point is, depending on the company you're interviewing at, these behavioral interviews might be labeled differently or might claim to focus on different things. Now, the other thing that makes them difficult to define is that, like I hinted at before, they might actually be delivered differently. So, for example, you might get a full 45-minute interview that is a behavioral interview. Or you might even get 2 full 45-minute interviews that are behavioral interviews. Typically, that would only be if you're applying for a managerial position or a leadership position, but for a normal software engineer, I would say it's just 1 interview, but you might get 2. Or on the flip side, you might actually get a behavioral interview that's only half of another technical interview. As an example, when I interviewed at Facebook for a software engineering position, my final interview of the day, my 4th interview, was about 2/3 behavioral. The first 30 minutes were behavioral, and then the last 15 minutes were coding. It was just a coding interview for the last 15 minutes. So again, point is, kind of difficult to give a clear-cut definition of what a behavioral interview is, because they might look a little bit different depending on the company and who you are. Now, on the other hand, I did mention that behavioral interviews are actually easy to define, and the reason they're easy is because, at the end of the day, no matter what they're called, what the companies tell you they're called, whatever, no matter any of that, they all assess you on basically the same things. They all assess you on those nuanced software engineering skills that I mentioned in the introductory video that we've got right here on the behavioral interviews content on Algo Expert, and they all look for the same qualities in you, the candidate. And here, I could list off dozens of qualities that they look for in candidates. They're really any quality that you would expect someone would want in a software engineer or in an employee. Things like humility, respect, being a good team player, being able to work under pressure, being able to handle conflict, to learn from your mistakes, to show initiative, to show leadership. All of these types of qualities, these behavioral interviews are looking for and are assessing. Now, hopefully at this point, you understand, what these behavioral interviews are looking for, but you might be wondering, okay, what are they though? What is a behavioral interview? What might I expect from a behavioral interview? And here it's pretty simple. Basically, a behavioral interview is going to be a conversation, a long conversation between you and the interviewer, except that the conversation will be almost entirely one-sided. They will be asking you a few questions, and you have to talk for most of the time. And these questions will almost exclusively be about your background and your experiences, with a few caveats like, why are you interested in our company? Or, tell me about your strengths and weaknesses. Although even that one is basically about your background. But so these questions will be asked in such a way, or rather with the intention, that you paint a picture or that you describe your background and experiences, and through this description, paint a picture of yourself that is ideally positive, that ideally shows that you have those qualities that we're looking for, that ideally shows that you have those nuanced software engineering skills, and so on and so forth. So the types of questions that you might be asked, we have dozens of them here on the behavioral interviews content on AlgoExperts. If you scroll down on the page, you'll see a bunch of them, and we give you also sample answers. But they're things like, tell me about a challenging project that you worked on, and what lessons did you learn from it? Or tell me about a time where you were working on a project and there was a low performer on the project. How did you handle that situation? Or tell me about a time where you had to give or receive tough feedback. These types of questions. And again, there are many of them that you can be asked. We cover a lot of examples on this page on the behavioral interviews content on AlgoExpert, and you have to be able to draw from your experiences to answer them. Now, one important thing to note here is that depending on the interview, and this might depend on the interviewer, like the person asking you the questions, it might depend on the company, but depending on whatever situation you find yourself in, you might be asked questions that are a little bit more detailed, or you might be asked questions that are less detailed. So if you look at the ones that we have here on AlgoExpert, you'll notice that they err on the detailed side. Most of our questions are almost divided into 3 questions. For example, it'll be something like, tell me about a time where you did something, then how did you handle that situation, and then what lessons did you learn from it? Those are 3 different questions. And that's why the sample answers that I give here on AlgoExpert are actually relatively long. Some of them are 7, 8, even 9 minutes. Those are on the longer end of what I would advise you to take as far as time goes in a normal behavioral interview answer. But it's possible that in your interviews, you might be asked the same questions just divided into 3 parts in a more conversational way. So you might be asked, describe briefly a challenging project that you worked on, period. And you would answer for about 2 or 3 minutes. Then, how did you handle this project? Or how did you distribute the work amongst your peers for this project? And you answer with 3 or 4 minutes. Then, what are some lessons that you drew from this project? So the point that I'm trying to make here is that there's no, clear-cut way in which a behavioral interview question might be asked, and you have to be ready or prepared to, deal with different ways that it might be asked. Now, the last thing that's important to note here about behavioral interviews is that, and this is kind of a nice thing, there is no right or wrong answer to a behavioral interview question. You can certainly give a poor answer, and we'll get into what that means in the next video, the video where we share some general tips on how to do well in these behavioral interviews, but you can't really give a wrong answer. It's not like a coding interview where you can literally give a wrong answer. You can give an answer that doesn't pass the test cases, an incorrect algorithm, or something with a bug. Here, if I ask you, tell me about a challenging project that you worked on, there is no better answer for a challenging project. It doesn't matter if the challenging project that you choose to talk about is something incredibly complex like, the Google search algorithms, I'm just making stuff up, or if it's something very simple like, a pet project that you worked on in college, if you're a new grad, that you worked on, on the side, like a little application, a web app. It doesn't really matter. What matters is, can you paint a story? Can you describe your experience in such a way that highlights some of the qualities that we hinted at earlier and some of those software engineering skills that we talked about in the introductory video here on AlgoExpert. That's what matters. There is no right or wrong answer. And that's really nice about behavioral interviews, because that means that you shouldn't be too stressed about your background. Instead, you should just focus on, how can I highlight positive things from my background? And the one caveat here is that, unfortunately, some people will take this to mean that they don't need to prepare at all for behavioral interviews, and that can actually backfire on them, because even though there are no right or wrong answers, you do need to be able to highlight these good things that we just mentioned. You need to be able to talk about your past experiences in such a way that will be meaningful. And the thing that these companies do is that they really go in detail to really understand all the nuances of your past experience. So if they ask you something like, tell me about a challenging project, they don't just want you to tell them, I worked on a web app. They're going to really dig deep to understand what exactly is it that you did, what exactly were your teammates doing, what exactly was the conflict, and so on and so forth. So from that point of view, you do still need to be prepared to go into detail and to talk in depth about these things. And also, depending on your comfort with impromptu speaking, you might want to be, prepared on all these topics. So at this point, hopefully you have a clear idea of what a behavioral interview is and what it looks like, the types of questions that you might be asked. And again, if you scroll down on this page, you'll see a bunch of them, a bunch of examples, and of course you'll see a bunch of sample answers. And now in the next video, we're going to cover some tips on how to not give poor answers, how to give good answers, although I did say that there's no good answer. I meant more that there's no right answer. So we'll go over some tips on how to give a good answer, what things to avoid, what things to do, and so on and so forth. On that note, I'll see you in the next video.